We have a great panel of guests today with us to discuss these very important issues, especially within the context of the next budget, MFF, also in plans for the Investeu financing structures that some of our panelists actually directly will help to manage in the future, which clearly will seek to leverage billions in funds to finance projects across the EU over the coming years. So maybe I just briefly introduce our panelists. We have Pablo Chavez, who's immediately to my left. He's the Vice President for Global Public Policy and Government Relations at Google Cloud. He obviously has a big stake in what happens to the digital agenda in Central and Eastern Europe, and I'm sure can tell us about some interesting studies and figures on what is needed and the scale of the investment needed in the future. We also have Przemysław Czesensky, who's a member of the management board at BGK Bank in Warsaw. So a major player in the management of the Investeu fund in the future as well. So he'll have lots to talk about on that. We also have Vasil Hudak, who's Vice President of the European Investment Bank. He obviously has a great macro understanding of not just transport or energy, but just general infrastructure financing generally. And finally, Tamás Bernát, who works for the Hungarian Development Bank, who will also have a big voice in how Investeu funds are mobilized in the future. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here today for this discussion. Maybe I will kick off by posing one simple question to you and letting you riff on this for a minute or two, starting with you, Pablo. Can digital economy, or can the digital economy, provide a new engine for growth in Central and Eastern Europe, and how can it do this?
Terrific. Well, first of all, thank you very much for including Google on this panel. You mentioned big ideas. I also have very big ears, and they feel bigger with these things. I don't know if you can tell that they're pushing them out, so I'm a little bit self-conscious. We are very, very bullish on the digital economy in Central and Eastern Europe at Google, and from the specific perspective that I focus on mostly, which is Google Cloud. We are really looking at the region as potentially embracing new technologies, including artificial intelligence, within artificial intelligence, machine learning, and using that in order to bolster both purely digital businesses, but as well as businesses that are in other industries, so agriculture, manufacturing, and so forth. All of them can really benefit from digital transformation. And so when we've been looking at Central and Eastern Europe, we have this idea that all of the growth that's happened over the last several years, we believe that it'll continue, but we believe also that it can be tremendously enhanced by focusing on digital. And in order to maybe put a little bit of rigor and analysis behind that belief, we supported a study that is in process right now by McKinsey, and we have some representatives from McKinsey in the room, that is really focused on the CEE region as the region of challenging on the digital front, basically a region of digital challengers. And what we mean by that is basically that as we see labor costs and other factors that have driven the regional economy to date, we believe that by infusing the existing factors with digital, we believe that can actually lead to significant economic growth. One of the stats that came out of the McKinsey study, which by the way will be made available later this month, I think we have a summary of it, an executive summary of it here in the room that one of my colleagues can give you if you're interested in it. By 2025, the study indicates that we could create about 200 billion euros in GDP in the region. That's the equivalent of essentially Czechia's economy or perhaps Portugal's economy. That's the addition of that kind of economic development in the region through digital. And more than happy to talk a little bit about how we could accomplish that, but as an overview and as a highlight, that is what the report indicates, and it is one of the reasons why we are, again, tremendously bullish about this region. We really think that it is a massive driver of economic growth through digital, both in Europe and throughout the world.
Thanks. And Vasil, maybe you can also add in what exactly the EIB is doing in this sphere, if it's doing enough.
Well, maybe I'll start, as you mentioned, it's more macro view from the EIB perspective, from European Luxembourg, if you say. we are facing some really important gaps in terms of economic development and structural gaps in the European economy. I have some numbers because I think numbers, they say quite a lot. We did a research, EIB research, and we estimated that the EU27, because we are looking at 2019 EU without UK, unfortunately, but that's the reality. We estimate that the so-called investment gap in EU27 is around 400 billion euro. This is 400 billion per year of investment which is needed in different sectors of economy just to be able to catch up with the United States and with the growing parts of the global economy. And this includes, for example, 155 billion to upgrade energy networks, 50 billion to transport networks, 50 billion for broadband, data center capacity and cybersecurity, 7 billion for climate change investments, and an additional, and this is an important number, 110 billion a year needs to be invested in R&D just to, again, catch up with the level of the investments in the United States and China. So the numbers are huge. Also, if you look at the situation today with the technology companies, and my colleagues, they gave interesting thing. If you look at the main technology companies which are listed globally on the global stock exchanges, you have the big US group of technology companies, so-called FAANGs, which is basically Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and our Google friends, and under Alphabet. And then you have in China, it's so-called BATs, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. So these are world's largest firms, and their combined stock market capitalization is around $4 trillion, which is a fifth of the US GDP. And if you look at the European side, the highest valued European tech company, which is SAP, is only the world's 60th most valued tech company. So you see a huge discrepancy in terms of the investment on the public side into innovation, into technology, but also a gap which is then reflected on the private sector side, where we see that the European technological leaders are falling behind. Now the question is, what do we do about that, and how do we address this issue also in Central Eastern Europe? We believe that one element which has to be done is to push more investments into this area. EIB is one of the leaders at the European level. For example, last year in 2017, where our level of investment, annual investment was around 80 billion euro, we invested 14 billion into innovation type of projects. So it's quite a lot of money which is going into the European companies and European public sector projects which have strong innovation element. Also, we are managing, as you may know, under the Juncker plan, there is the European Fund for Strategic Investments, which is pushing money into more risky projects because they can utilize so-called guarantee provided by the European budget and EIB. I'm glad that Gordon Baina is here, who is actually a member of the investment committee, which is independent of the EIB and decides on the allocation of the guarantees for individual projects. But I think in Central Europe, there are activities which we are trying to promote and which we believe will bring more innovation and digitization into economy. One such area where we are working closely, for example, with the development banks and with Tamás and Przemek, this is the area of smart cities and smart regions. So basically, how do you bring technology and connect local technology companies with local development, with local mayors, with local cities and regions, and creating this kind of bottom-up innovation drive, which we believe is very important. But also basically building on the traditional economies which we have in these countries, like in Slovakia, it's very much the car industry. And yesterday we had the launch of what we call Slovak Battery Alliance, which is also a way how to bring more innovation into traditional sectors of economy, but make them more value-added and important for the region. Maybe the last point I want to mention is that with all this money, all these efforts, we cannot move much further if we don't connect with education. And all our surveys show that another important gap, which is not so much financial, but of course connected to money, is the gap in skills of the labor force. And unfortunately, our schools, universities are still producing students who are, to a large degree, not relevant for the needs of the modern digital market economy. So I think this is an important issue which we also have to address.
Thank you. Maybe if I could just then ask Tamas, you've had the top-down view, if you like, from Luxembourg, the big macro view. What can a national development bank do to foster digitalization?
Well, to start out, thanks for the question. I was about to quote the same McKinsey study for two reasons. I'm a bit partial to the firm. First of all, I used to work there. But second, I actually think that going beyond the first layer of things is always a good idea. And with digital economy, I really think we should go beyond the very first layer and just call it, digital, and that's it. Rather, I would rather propose three kinds of differentiations. One is, which I understand comes out from this study, is that, if you compare, we always talk about the East-West divide in these kind of things, but if you actually compare the GDP produced by digital economy in the top 5, the biggest Western European economies, with those in the Central and Eastern European part of the world, then you find that actually a bigger share is produced of the GDP in the CE countries than in the top 5 ones. Actually, 6.5% compared to 5. So not a huge difference, but still actually a larger part. Where you really find the lagging is compared to the front runners, compared to countries like Denmark or the Netherlands, where 10, 12, even more % of the GDP is already due to the digital economy. So there is this kind of differentiation that we have to keep in mind. This partially comes from leapfrogging. Some of our economies actually started to develop things after some developed countries already developed them. Think of one very specific and easy example, toll booths on motorways. Whoever drives on a motorway in France or Italy has to stop or at least slow down very much at those booths. Now, for example, in Hungary, it's totally digital. You don't even have stickers anymore. It's fully digitalized because we actually started to build motorways of current quality later than anybody did in France or Italy. So there is a reason why this is a bit differentiated. Then the other thing where it's differentiated is, across Central and Eastern Europe. And there I have to be a bit self-critical about Hungary. For example, in e-government, we are very much lagging behind the best ones like Estonia. And this is one of the things that we want to concentrate on in the coming years. And the third level of differentiation would be across industries. And I think that there it's really important, and that's where a development bank can come in and where investment gaps can be identified, to realize that, when you talk about digital, mostly you have things in mind which you personally always use, like digital banking. However, maybe the biggest opportunities are in areas such as agriculture or healthcare, or actually, as I said, e-government. And we would like to actually find where these biggest opportunities are in Hungary and in Central and Eastern Europe.
Thank you. Przemysław, what is the view from Warsaw on these issues?
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for letting me present the perspective of Poland and BGK on the initiative. Our perspective is very much focused on fostering the cooperation in the Central Eastern European region. And as far as the direction of the investment that President Hudak mentioned, energy, infrastructure, transportation, we fully in line with that. But we think that where the biggest gap is in the Central European region, where during the second half of the 20th century we had a big slowdown in the development, and now we need to catch up and close the gaps, especially in the transportation and infrastructure, going from north to south or south to north. We have fairly well developed east-west infrastructure as far as the energy and transportation goes, but we also need to enable better cooperation between the northern countries in our region and the southern countries that will link those sub-regions effectively. Even though this is the beginning, we already have many initiatives that are at least named, sometimes better designed, like Via Carpathia, for example, or the Constanza Gdańsk Railroad. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that actually perfectly brought us on to what I wanted to talk about next, which was to open up a little bit of a more fluid debate on where money should go, exactly what kind of projects should be invested in. Of course, you mentioned, of course, Via Carpathia, also energy links, the LNG terminals in Poland and Croatia, and connecting them with pipelines. But I wonder on the digital side to start off, Pablo, where do you think money is needed most? Is it in maybe smaller municipal projects? Is it in improving cellular connection in local areas? Where urgently needs money to foster digitalization? And guys, do feel free to jump in and interrupt each other and fight a little bit to make it exciting if you see fit.
Well, I would leave it to the experts to give a sense of where government money and other sources of financing should go. Perhaps the perspective that I could add to this would be just to highlight a couple of points that have been previously made. Certainly education is critical, and this is an issue that we see globally. It is, it's not simply the idea of improving education, but rather aligning education with the needs of businesses, both digital and non-digital, focusing significantly more on skills. One debate that I've been involved in and very, very familiar with in the United States is this question about degrees versus skills, and whether a bachelor's degree in political science is worth as much or more or less than skills in being able to program in a particular language. So education focused perhaps more on skills and perhaps more on the needs of employers. That we can find out through data and through tools in connecting educational institutions to employers. That is an area perhaps of investment. Secondly, and this has been a common theme at this conference, entrepreneurship. The investment in entrepreneurship, which might sound a little bit strange, but there is a way to promote that through educational institutions, through government, and more broadly through society. One tremendously interesting example that I've become aware of here in Slovakia is a company called Exponia. Exponia is a startup, it's a digital startup. It's based in Bratislava. It is essentially a micro multinational. It has offices throughout the world. It's supporting companies throughout the world. And it is really a company that is founded by a couple of individuals who decided that they did not want to work for the large companies. They wanted to build their own company, but they were very much driven by the fact that they had digital skills and the fact that they were very much entrepreneurs. The third area of investment, and perhaps it's not investment, and perhaps it's more a point of cooperation, as you were saying before, is for the governments of Central and Eastern Europe to unite around these themes. Really there is an opportunity, when you think about scale and you think about platforms, you have scale and you have a platform here in the region. Somebody mentioned before that if you brought all of the economies of Central and Eastern Europe together, you'd have the 12th largest economy in the world. Well, that is scale. And for governments in the region to really kind of think about how to perhaps collaborate and cooperate more, perhaps around these issues of entrepreneurship and education, as well as enhancing a true digital single market and other policy areas, that could also be an area for investment and cooperation.
Thank you. And Vasil, this is something that I think you brought up in your introduction, was the issue of education and research around this. Of course, the Investeu program will also focus money towards these kind of initiatives. But what is happening now, and how easy is it to directly fund education projects from the EIB level?
Well, I think when you look at the correlation between the European level and the national level in the EU, you have to take into account that the EU budget is only 1% of the total EU GDP. So it's relatively small. It's about 2% of the public spending in the European Union. So really the main focus in the EU has to be on the national public finance and national budgets. Of course, the European level of financing and the EU budget can provide some type of incentives in these sectors, which are really important. And where also you bring kind of European additional value into the financing. I think that overall, and as I mentioned, the priorities on the national level, I think the governments are responsible for creating a pro-innovation environment in their countries. And this is where you have to talk about education, obviously. You have to talk about helping to develop broadband connectivity. You have to talk about issues such as support for the startups. I remember when I was Minister of Economy here in Slovakia, we did a lot of work, for example, on creating a legal and financial environment for the Slovak startups to be able to grow, to make it as easy and simple as possible to register, to get the financing, to be able to grow, and so on. So these are some of the steps which have to be done. On the educational side, for example, we introduced, and this is now moving forward, is the dual education, vocational education, which means that students, especially in the secondary schools, are able to go and work in the industries, in companies, and this also helps to kind of bridge this divide between the education, which may go outside of what are the needs of the market and the economy. So I think these are some of the measures which should be undertaken on the governmental and national level. On the types of financing, where we see from the EIB perspective, but I think this is felt certainly on the national level, and what is needed in Europe is certainly the equity financing for the innovative companies. Maybe there is enough of startup financing, but what we are lacking in Europe is financing for scale-ups. So when a startup grows, usually what we see in Europe is that many of these companies, innovative, excellent companies, they then leave for United States, for China, for Israel, etc., because there is no, basically no access to the type of financing which would be available for the scale-ups. So what we have developed in the EIB is so-called debt financing, debt equity financing, the kind of quasi-equity, which can help and support these kind of scale-ups in their further development. So I think that these are some of the initiatives which can be done, both from the European and the national level, and eventually they need to complement each other.
And Tamas, I wanted also to ask you about an interesting initiative in Hungary, is the inauguration of a test track for autonomous vehicles. I wonder, how successful do you think the country has been so far in fostering these kind of research hubs and, of course, retaining talent then to work on self-driving car systems, LiDAR technology for detecting passengers? What can your bank do, and how successful has the government been in creating these kind of research hubs and centers?
Thank you for the question. Actually, we have an interesting situation where Hungary, by the way, a bit similarly to Slovakia, is focusing very much on the car industry. 14% of the GDP is produced by the car industry, plus some other related areas, which is obviously good from a specialization point of view, but also a risk if you look at the future of cars. So, is that me? Or? Okay.
It was a very powerful voice.
Yeah.
Artificial intelligence.
You wanted fight. There you go.
I think these are the Slovaks who are unhappy that BMW selected Debrecen.
Oh, that's why. Sorry, Košice. No, seriously, the idea would be to look at where cars are heading, I mean, literally as well on the test drive, but even more importantly in terms of development. And it's quite obvious that e-cars are part of the future and part of the self-driving development is also taking place in Hungary, especially with trucks, by the way, not exactly personal cars, but rather trucks. And this is one of the things that, yes, we are proud of, and it's an overbooked test drive facility already, although it hasn't opened yet. So we think it was a good idea to build it. And this is a good example of how to build on your strengths, so to speak. But more generally, I think that from a development bank perspective and also from a government perspective, there is also a question with digitization, which goes back to the point of how you basically, when you digitize, usually outsource some tasks to the customer. I mean, we don't like to call it that way, but I mean, our bank also introduced a lending procedure which is fully digital. So the customer at home basically puts in all the data and attaches all the documents that normally the bank advisor would do. Now the problem is, and I guess there are many in the room who already tried to digitize some of their processes, but first of all you have to completely dumb down, simplify, and really streamline your processes to be able to digitize it. And then you usually find that it's still not understandable enough. It's still not used in a foolproof way. It's still a lot of times full of errors and mistakes on the customer side. Why is that? Partially because they are just not educated enough in using this system, in using these kind of processes, and actually they feel alienated. And if you take this to the logical conclusion, then you will end up with people who are very much at home in a digitized world and people who are not, and then they are going to slowly be excluded from services, be it e-government or commercial services. So I think keeping up that balance and actually taking care of the education in that sense is one of the key tasks for a development bank and for a country as such.
Thank you. Przemysław, Poland doesn't have such a huge car industry compared to its Visegrad 4 neighbors, but there's clearly a big role that digitalization is playing, especially in Warsaw. Can you speak a little bit about what your bank is doing on these projects?
Yes, relatively our car industry is not as big as in Hungary and Slovakia, but in absolute terms is also not negligible. I started in the first round talking about the big projects since Bank Gospodarstwa Krajowego is a development bank that supports the government policies in the investment strategies, investment programs. And obviously government likes big projects. But in parallel, we would like to couple this direction with supporting the segment that President Hudak already talked about, which is startups, which is micro, small and medium companies. Today we use the cohesion funds to support that segment, and in the future we would like the Investeu initiative to create the environment for supporting that segment, because in Poland we see that as the best way to grow domestic capital, which will then support further development of the economy.
That was perfect, and also brings us on perfectly to what I wanted to talk about next. But Vasil, you just had a quick point.
I just want to mention that I think there are growing evidences of countries of this region of Central Europe coming together to support innovation. And I'm just looking at Ernst, my friend, who is working very much on the idea of so-called Danube Tech Valley. Basically, how do you bring best minds and best innovative companies in this area, ranging from Germany, Austria, Slovakia, Hungary, to Romania, de facto, how you connect them, how you bring them together, and to support also the growth of innovative companies throughout the region, because they also need a scale in terms of further development. And another example where EIB was also participating in cooperation with the national development banks in this region is so-called Central Europe Fund of Funds, which is an equity fund where countries like Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Slovenia, Austria put their own money, with EIB matching this pool and creating de facto a fund of over 200 million euro, which we wish could be 200 million
Next year.
It's quite enough next year. 200 million euro, which will be used primarily for the support of innovative companies in this region on the equity level. So these are very good, I think, very good first initiatives where these countries are actually coming together, understanding that they can have a bigger piece or a small piece of bigger pie, whatever you call it, but basically creating a better space, better conditions for innovative companies in the countries to grow.
Thanks. I just want to move on to the MFF and what should happen in the future, and this was something I think all of you have now alluded to. Just before I do that, anybody got any questions for our panelists about the topics we've discussed so far? Anybody there? Not yet. which means we can go straight on to the future. So we've got the discussions in Brussels right now are focusing on what to do about the next MFF, but then also how to set up the cohesion fund in the future as an element of the Connected Europe facility. There's also a lot of talk about how you blend funds, also how you leverage synergies between sectors and create energy and digital projects, transport digital projects. I wonder if all of you could maybe give your thoughts on what you think policymakers in Brussels need to really consider right now as they're putting the finishing touches to these proposals. Maybe, Przemysław, if we could start with you at that end for once.
Well, I think there is many challenges that the policymakers in the EU are facing, and the upcoming perspective will be way more difficult than the previous two. I actually don't have a ready recommendation or ready advice. We rather look at it as sort of a follow-on challenge for the member countries, and Poland will be one of those. That's why I mentioned that what we have now, which is relatively large support from the cohesion policy of the EU, may not come in the same scale in the next perspective. So we seek many different ways of closing this gap. One of the things that we are doing is we moving as much as possible from grant model to financial instruments. So we already have some success in this. In the previous perspective, this perspective is even more focused on the financial instruments. So we expect to have revolving money fueling the growth of especially the SME segment, but also in the other parts of the economy as well.
Thanks. And Tamas, your view?
It's similar. I would start with the idea of centralized and decentralized funds in the EU, because that's actually a key point in making any recommendations about how the future should look like. The point is that now there are in the structural funds already financial instruments, meaning money that has to be repaid, refundable loans or private equity envelopes. And this is part of the decentralized part of the funds. Whereas there is the centralized part, which is now termed FC for short, and which would be replaced by Investeu. Now, our experiences with the two sorts of funds, even though both are financial instruments, are very different. On the decentralized side, Hungary actually has the third highest rate of financial instruments, so repayable, refundable, or actually has to be repaid, kind of. Should be repaid. Refundable is a bit technically correct, but not the right term. So anyway, of that, that share is actually 8% compared to the total envelope, which is higher than even the EU average. And the two other countries which are even higher are also CE countries. This is the funds actually that the bank that I'm managing, MFB, is managing in Hungary. It's quite a success. Actually, we've been through more of the sources, more of the funds than most EU countries. 90% is already used up compared to 44, which is the average. And also, especially in the private equity space, which we've been talking about, talking about startups, we are, I mean, maybe even too dominant. I'm happy that Commissioner Vestager is not in the room anymore, because last year, actually, our funds were 90% of the total venture capital investment in Hungary, which basically means that there is no such market yet. So we have to build this market. So these funds work. These funds actually work. They are a big share of the total, and they are well placed in the economy. On the other hand, These were the decentralized funds. On the other hand, the centralized ones, well, we actually didn't have any FC project in Hungary until last week, because we just signed
Until Thursday.
Until Thursday, to be very exact. Because on Thursday, so 2 days ago, we signed an agreement with EIB to put 25 million euros into an SME refinancing facility backed by FC guarantees. But until then, we had zero. And more seriously, actually, the total region, CE as a region, has a total of 9% of total FC spend so far in this 7-year budget cycle. And we are speaking about 13 countries out of the 28. So our experience with the centrally managed FC funds is that it is mainly spent on the big economies. More than 60% actually went to the top 5 economies. And that is a problem for Central and Eastern Europe, and we would like to have an Investeu which actually makes these problems solvable, or actually tries to solve these problems at the very beginning.
Thank you. And Vasil, just to take that debate on a little bit, there's clearly been an issue of recent years, probably for good overall, that structural funds have really driven growth in parts of the EU, especially the newer member states. How do you think this is going to develop in the future? Could this become a problem, as Tamás said, when you have a situation where basically public funding is being used to drive a whole industry? Is it over-dependence?
Well, I have a kind of mixed feelings, frankly, about the structural investment funds of the EU in these countries. Yes, on one hand, they have played a very important role to move these countries towards convergence, getting closer to the levels of Western Europe. On the other hand, I think there is a negative element, which is the fact that these are certainly not market-based products, and they have created a certain mentality in these countries, which is very much grant-based mentality. So basically, we take the money, we don't have to repay the money, and it's not always not always good. So, but basically, looking at this issue from the European perspective, you have a difficult situation post-2020, because as in any budget, you have to have a revenue side and the expenditure side. On the revenue side, you have less money because of the Brexit. On the expenditure side, you have more needs, more so-called priorities of the European Union, because you have, in addition to the traditional ones like cohesion and common agricultural policy, you have now also European defense, you have migration, you have environment or climate change and so on. So you have more things you want to cover. So the big question for the European policymakers is how you do more with less. And that's I think the biggest dilemma for the future EU budget. Now, how you do it? On one hand, you have to cut somewhere. So there are cuts in cohesion policy and in common agricultural policy. The two elements have been traditionally around 2/3 of the EU budget. Of course, cohesion countries are unhappy. So we hear from ministers from the cohesion countries and regions this unhappiness. For Central Europe, it means decrease in the cohesion funding somewhere around plus minus 20 to 23%, which is quite a lot, obviously. And as I said in the beginning, there is a certain addiction to this type of money. And on the other hand, you need to somehow compensate for this gap. And the way the Commission is trying to compensate is by creating the so-called Investeu pool of money, which is de facto the financial instruments, as Tamás explained, the money that has to be repaid or should be repaid. The Investeu is very much modeled on the FC, on the Juncker plan, on the European Fund for Strategic Investments, where actually what we have achieved is that with the amount of guarantees for FC, so-called FC1, which is 21 billion, we have achieved an investment impact in Europe of over 300 billion euro. So it's a huge leverage. This is how we can very efficiently use public resources to actually get a big impact in terms of investment. And this is very much thanks to the fact that this type of money and proper use of financial instruments can leverage and engage private sector. So there is certainly more and more realization that we have these big investment gaps, which cannot be filled by public money, nor national, nor European, and you have to engage the private sector into this cooperation. And the only way how you can engage private sector is by creating so-called bankable projects, or at least have pieces of projects which are bankable, where you can blend some grant from the structural investment funds and some portion from the so-called financial instruments which has to be repaid. And this is now what the big thing is about. You know, how do we structure this future InvestEU? Who is eligible to use these guarantees? And obviously, national development banks like MFB in Hungary or BGK in Poland are getting ready for the utilization of this pool of money. The EIB has traditionally been in Europe the manager of the financial instruments on this centralized level. But I think in general it creates a good opportunity, especially for private sector, to be engaged in these projects, because we will need to be much more skillful and creative in developing projects which have this commercial, bankable, repayable element.
Thanks. Does anybody have any questions on the points raised or comments on the points raised so far? Yes, sir.
Gordon, yes.
Gordon Bajnai from Hungary. I sit on the FC Investment Committee, and I wanted to react on what Tamás said about the FC, because I'm Hungarian. I'd like to see much more Hungarian projects there. And my grandfather always told me in the 1970s that, you know, my uncle, if I don't play at the lottery, I usually don't win. So the problem is, at the FC Investment Committee, I've been there for over a year, almost 1.5 years. I've only three projects from Hungary coming in the infrastructure window. All three first supported. The last one on Friday this week, which is still not public which one it is, but only 3 projects. For Poland, we keep approving projects every month, sometimes 2 or 3 in one session. We approved one yesterday as well. So there is a very strong difference between the countries. Bulgaria is the number 4 on a GDP proportional drawdown of FC. And Bulgaria is not a more developed or larger economy than Hungary. So I think there is a difference between the activity of the given countries. And here, the local presence of EIB and the development banks matters on generating those projects. And those projects can come from the private sector and the public sector. What is a clear difference is, what I see, is that in Western Europe, more projects come from the private sector. In, for example, Hungary, the 3 projects we approved, one is a quasi-private sector, the 2 are publicly owned companies who received, by the way, very large support. We have also, on the other windows, there are already signed contracts with banks on funding SME loans in Hungary, for example, that was not mentioned. So the FC, I don't think, is biased for the larger economies. But there is certainly a factor to be taken into account that in Central and Eastern Europe, there are the structural funds, which are a huge proportion of GDP-related development, around 3% of the GDP per annum. So that's money for free, and that's non-recourse money, as you mentioned. That's something that doesn't need to be repaid. So that free money is also reducing the projects that need recourse funding. There is a crowding out impact of that. As we expect in the new MFF, that it is widely expected or forecasted that the structural funds, the free money, the grant money will reduce. I expect that the demand for recourse money, i.e. lending and equity, will increase in these countries as well. But it is worth running already for the FC projects now, because you need to learn the methodology. You need to learn to play the bureaucratic system so that when the demand is there, you can use it efficiently. Thank you.
Thanks.
If I may on this,
Just be very interested to get Tamás's thoughts.
started
I was
a lot of reactions.
ad hominem. Well, as I said, 9% was the total for Central and Eastern Europe. And that's actually an EIB number. So we can discuss country between country, and a lot of projects from one country and not that many from another, and the basic point is actually right. Obviously, if you don't submit projects, you don't get funding. But the total of these 13 countries, including Bulgaria, including Poland, is 9%. So there is still something wrong if this is the end result. And that is also true for what you're saying about public and private, because, well, everything that we as a publicly owned institution can do is to directly leverage some incentives on the publicly owned ones and to try to get the private ones to actually submit projects. And there, another point is, and actually that's leading to Investeu, I think a very good idea to enlarge the technical assistance part of this whole program. Because, to be frank, there is not much knowledge, especially not in the dispersed private sector, to submit the right projects. And economies where there is more knowledge already accumulated throughout decades for that are obviously at an advantage. And that's where we have, that's what leads to the kind of situation we are in now with FC.
Przemysław, if I could just ask you very, very quickly to respond to this point. Why does Poland get a new road every week and Hungary barely gets anything? What's the secret?
They play lottery.
No, Poland is not covered by roads yet. We have still forests and meadows and beautiful nature. We have very efficient system of devising projects which then are submitted as for the EU support. This is true. We also have a very effective mechanisms for distributing the especially financial instruments. I'm talking about this because this is what I manage on a daily basis. We really well address the support to our companies, and I think the reason is that we really care for this. I mean, for us, we coming out of communism, we had literally no private capital, and still I don't know what's the structure of those projects. Is it are they originated from the public companies? Probably, if private, those are not natively Polish. They probably are some foreign investments in Poland who have the capability to apply for big support for big projects.
And Vasil,
Just to add to what Przemek mentioned, I think in Poland, on one hand, I think kind of genetically, Poles were always very entrepreneurial. I remember when even during the socialist times, you could see these maluchy, the Fiats, little Fiats, driving all over Central Europe, always carrying some big stuff on top of the Fiats, and Poles sitting inside, squeezed. Now you see them in Mercedeses and BMWs and so on. But anyway, so I think that there is this very natural interest and ability on the Polish side, also on the corporate side, to develop projects which are actually bankable, where you can use financial instruments and where FC can be one of the sources of investment. And secondly, in Poland, you have a strongly decentralized system, and the województwa, the regions, or the cities are very active in developing projects which qualify for FC guarantee. So, for example, we have several projects in the Polish regions which are financed through FC, like regional hospitals, where actually the hospitals are modernized and built with the support of FC, and they're kind of off-balance sheet entities, or some PPP structures for local regional infrastructure, like in Krakow, the bypass around Krakow. So I think Poland has really done a lot in this area.
Thank you. And Pablo, just to pull you back into the conversation.
I have nothing to say about banks or...
Yeah, but you do have something to say, I would imagine, about the role of digitalization in this, because the EU now is making a very, very big push to make sure that however it calibrates the next budgetary period, it creates lots of synergies. So it specifically asks project backers to present them with projects that combine transport with digitalization initiatives. I just wonder, from the perspective from Washington, is Europe ahead of the game on doing this? Is this a very future-oriented look at infrastructure, instead of saying we need to build a road and then later we'll update it with connected car technology and sensors? What's the modern way of looking at funding infrastructure?
No, that is the modern way of looking at funding infrastructure. And I think that more and more what we're seeing is a couple of things. I mean, one, there's the physical infrastructure piece. Two, there's the aspect of preparing not just for, in the case of building roads for, the roads and the cars of today, but the roads and the cars for tomorrow with sensors and so forth. And this gets to the Internet of Things part of it. Then the third piece of it is leveraging the data that's coming out of both the use of this infrastructure and the infrastructure itself. What we have found is that there is tremendous opportunity, both in terms of the use of infrastructure, or even in the previous case of automobile manufacturing. I mean, the amount of data that the factories in this region, the amount that it's generating, is really significant, and it tells you a lot about the longevity of parts, the efficiency of manufacturing, the value of certain different materials that go into the vehicles. And it does really raise this question in terms of thinking about kind of the digital future of Central and Eastern Europe, how the region really thinks of itself. For example, in the context of automobile manufacturing, is the competitive advantage one of labor costs? Is the competitive advantage one of logistics? And perhaps the question is also, can the competitive advantage be one of technology and of leveraging data and of building digital infrastructure around those factories? We think that there's a tremendous amount of promise, again, not just for digital companies, but for, again, manufacturing companies and other companies that can really leverage these tools. And just as a final thing, because I should remind everybody, there is this McKinsey report that's coming out. We have the executive summary of it that's available. Hopefully we can work together both with governments and with private sector stakeholders to turn those ideas into reality. One point that the report makes is that the time is now, and there is a fair amount of urgency in taking advantage of the digital promise. So we would love to work with you, and we're looking forward to that.
Thank you. And just a very quick point as well, going back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of education. Specifically, would Google Cloud consider having more staff in the Central European region? Is there space for research clusters around universities? How do you view the...
Yes, and for sure more. We already do a number of those kinds of partnerships, a lot of training, a lot of support for entrepreneurs. And from a strict cloud perspective, one thing that we found is that one of the challenges of cloud adoption, and this is not just for Central and Eastern Europe, it's a global challenge, is skills. That there is not enough knowledge within companies that are in other industries that are not yet digital, in the knowledge about like how to use these tools and how to leverage them to enhance business models. So that's another area of education that we'll be focused on.
Okay, we quickly approaching the 10 seconds left time, but I want to ask you one very, very brief and slightly cheeky question to conclude with. If you had the European Council in front of you now, the 27, soon but 28 EU leaders, looking ahead to how they should fund infrastructure in the future, what would be the message that you think they should get on how to calibrate the next budgetary period for issues of infrastructure, education, etc.? Maybe if I could ask Warsaw, then Budapest, then Luxembourg, and then the Washington perspective to close.
As I said, I'm not prepared to give advice. I think it is important to maintain this dual approach that we have now, which is cohesion, so that Europe becomes more similar. There's the differences among the regions are reduced, and the ideas like Investeu or Juncker Plan, where Europe is supported in the global competition.
Thank you. Tamas?
Well, I would say something like, please make sure there's a level playing field, and if there is not one yet, then please work on creating one.
Basil?
Well, I think that we have to make sure that there is more engagement of private sector in all these projects, and I think that we have to make sure that the European money or national money, public money, creates opportunities for private sector to be engaged. That's why we have to make them simpler, easier to use, and create projects which would bring public and private together.
And Pablo to conclude.
I agree, and I'll say that I'm looking at a sign that says "Time's up."
All right, there you go. If you could join me in thanking our panelists, would be great. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you, everyone, for coming.